Hi, it's Dr. N. We're back again for another lesson. Today we're talking about discovering your food reactivity. This is something that's going to be important not just throughout this program phase, but something that you'll need to understand for the rest of your life because food is either promoting health and wellness or detracting away from that. And one of the biggest ways that food can be your enemy is by consuming foods that you don't know that you're reacting to. Now, we'll clarify issues related to types of reactions in terms like allergies and sensitivities and intolerances in just a moment, but let's start with our goals for today. Today, we're going to do a very quick check again on the core four concepts related to food and diet in general. Then we'll go into understanding food sensitivities, including some comments on the different types of testing out there and why we don't always do testing on every single client. And then talk about the elimination provocation challenge and make sure that you understand when it's appropriate to do that. And we'll talk about how as well. So here's the very quick core four summary with food. We're going to hit this fairly quickly because by this time we should have this down, maybe even committed to memory. But one of the most important things with your diet is to make sure that you're paying attention to content. We don't have freedom to eat absolutely everything we want without consequence. Maybe there was a time in our lives where we could have gotten away with that, but we're older, our systems tend to wear down a little bit. Plus, as a society, we've changed food. So we have chosen the Paleo Quick Start. And just a reminder, that's a largely plant-based diet with moderate amounts of protein and moderate amounts of healthy fat. So that's the content piece. The next thing is quantity. We want to make sure that you're in the calorie ballpark. You have to be eating enough food and of good content and quality to make sure that you're meeting the energetic needs. The most common problem we see with most of our clients when they change their diet and go clean, so to speak, is dropping their calories too low. And again, we should have worked through some of these things. But if you feel like you have questions on this or you don't have it quite worked out, please make sure that you let us know either through the patient portal or bring it up with your one-on-one sessions. The next thing is to talk about quality. So once we understand what kinds of food we should be eating, how much we should be eating, we want to make sure we're eating as cleanly as possible. And now's a good time to remind you about the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen, as well as trying your best to source your meats and fish, being wild-caught fish and meats that are hormone antibiotic-free as best as you can. The next thing is frequency and timing. This is where your blood sugar pattern comes in, if you have one. Not everyone does, but certainly most of our clients do. And the frequency and timing of eating really depends on what your blood sugar pattern is. So I want you to make sure that you're referring back to whether you have reactive hypoglycemic tendencies or whether you have more insulin-resistant or hyperglycemic tendencies. And make sure you're using the guidelines and what you've learned through your own trial and error and experimentation as the best frequency and timing for you. And then finally, we want to talk about motivation, and that is making sure that you're eating to fuel function first. At this point, you should have some of this down that you're eating consistently and well, and function is starting to return. And at some point, you get some more freedom to do things just because you want to eat something, whether it's for taste or social occasions. But make sure that you're prioritizing fueling your systems and eating for functionality. So let's talk about terminology now. Within the whole world of food reactions, there are multiple terms that are thrown around almost interchangeably. And I have no problem doing that, quite honestly. It's only when you start getting into conversations with, say, classically trained allergists that terminology becomes a big problem. But what is the difference between allergy or sensitivity, and is that the same as a food intolerance? And are there other kinds of reactions that you can have where you clearly respond poorly to a food that you eat, but it's not grounded in some type of an immune response? And the answer to that is yes. So let's clarify what these terms mean. The first thing we're going to talk about is what are true allergies. And this is really, again, where the conventional system gets very specific. I will show you in a moment that there are different systems or subsystems within the immune system itself that drive certain kinds of reactions. And a true allergy from an allergist standpoint is something that is driven only by what's called the IgE system. Now, IgE as well as IgA, IgG, IgM. These are different types of antibody systems. And IgE reactions create what are commonly called a type 1 or an immediate onset reaction. And this is the kind of reaction that we're commonly associated with things like eating shellfish or peanuts, or even bee stings, where you get hives or itching, you get some kind of rash or swelling, maybe your throat closes over, your eyes swell shut, and this is your classic true allergy. And the way that this is tested for commonly is through skin prick testing, which is a little bit old school, but still done. Or you can also test this through blood. So anytime someone says the word allergy, they may be meaning this type of reaction, or they may be using the word allergy just in a general sense to mean any kind of reaction based on food or some type of environmental response. Now, a lot of what our clients have are not actually truly allergies, even though they are immune responses. And this falls into the realm of what we call sensitivities. And again, a classically trained allergist or immunologist would say that all other reactions are classified as non-IgE reactions. Remember, IgE is that very specific pathway through which your body responds with a true allergy. So non-IgE reactions are also called type 4 or delayed onset reactions. And it's called delayed onset because, as opposed to the immediate onset, which happens often within minutes, delayed onset actually can take several days. And so I might eat a food today, but I may not react until 2 or 3 days down the road. And that makes this very difficult to figure out just simply by doing a diet diary. Quite often our reaction is, or our tendency rather, is to react to a food and think, okay, well, what did I have for lunch? What did I have earlier today? But that may not be the issue. It may have been something that you had the day before. Now, within the allergy response and the type 1 reactions, the symptoms are pretty classic, and that is classic from person to person to person. With sensitivities, we lose that clarity because the sensitivity really ends up being specific to the individual person rather than the subset of the immune system or the food itself. So you and I might both react to something like a tomato through a sensitivity and not a true allergy, but I might get a migraine and a headache, and you might get fatigue and joint swelling. So it's really up to you as the individual to determine what the responses are. And this is commonly tested through blood. There are some other methodologies. We'll talk about technology in just a little bit. But I want you to know that the vast majority of reactions that are happening based on food are not true allergies, they are sensitivities. And even though we can't call them an allergy, nevertheless, there is this activation of the immune system. Now, this is all really just a discussion about terminology because at the end of the day, an immune reaction is an immune reaction, and it doesn't matter necessarily which type of pathway is being invoked or used. Now, there are a couple of other categories of food type responses. One would be thinking about these things called intolerances. Now, food intolerances are technically not immune responses, not in the same way with our immediate onset or delayed onset reactions that we just talked about. These are oftentimes rooted in things like enzyme deficiencies. And the greatest example, probably the most commonly known, would be something like lactose intolerance. Lactose is a specific kind of sugar that's found in dairy, and some people don't make an enzyme called lactase very efficiently, or they lose the ability to make that over time, and they acquire a dairy intolerance. And again, it's not an immune reaction, it's the difficulty in breaking down a sugar molecule, in this example that we're using, based off an enzymatic deficiency. Now, in this case, and again, we're just using lactose intolerance as an example, in this case, the enzyme deficiency changes how the milk protein, or I'm sorry, the milk sugar molecules are broken down, and that quite often leads to gastrointestinal symptoms like discomfort or gas or bloating or pain. Now, again, not an immune response, this is an enzyme deficiency. And then finally, we have a whole other world of reactions that happen not based on immune activation, not based on enzyme deficiencies or intolerance, but based on things like feeding critters. Like if you have an intestinal infection, whether it's a large intestine or colonic infection, or something in your small intestine like SIBO, what's called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, sometimes the foods that we feed them cause them to either activate an immune response or a chemical change. Or in some cases, like with SIBO, some of the foods we feed the critters cause these critters to make gases like hydrogen or methane. And so we can have somebody eat a food and get horribly gassy or bloated. We may see abdominal distension, and that may change bowel habits. There may be pain associated with that, but it's not an immune response. We're feeding critters, and then the critters are doing something that we experience symptomatically. So it's still related to a food reaction, but it's not in the same category as the others that we've already discussed. Now, we can also have another general category of food reactions that are independent of creating an immune response, and that would be things like mechanical irritation. And this would require that the gut is already inflamed to the point where any type of mechanical stimulation, things inside the gut space actually cause irritation. And the analogy would be like, for example, someone has a sunburn. The skin itself, other than the sunburn, is typically healthy. But when the sunburn damage occurs on that outer layer, you can just barely touch someone's shoulder and it hurts them. Now, it's not because you slap them, and it's not because they have skin cancer or anything like that, but it's because of that local environment with the surface epithelium being irritated by sun. So imagine that the gut is inflamed either because of food reactivity or leaky gut or whatever the case might be. If the gut lining is sufficiently irritated and inflamed, sometimes even simple things like water can cause pain. A lot of times we'll find acute, like a viral gastritis or maybe bacterial, but this is something, again, that is a food-related reaction that is not rooted specifically in turning on an immune response. So it's not an allergy, it's not a sensitivity, it's not an intolerance, but a lot of times there is some kind of infection. All right, so hopefully that clarifies some of the terminology. And remember, the vast majority of our clients are expressing problems associated with sensitivities, and I'm going to throw in there feeding critters. That's just a very, very common thing that we see. Now, the immune system is very highly organized. I want to try to give you a little bit of a mental picture about how complex this is. And this is a fairly simplistic map, so to speak. But I want to use the military as an example. For example, the military, we have different branches: the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. And each one of these are part of the military, but they do specific things, and they're good at some things and they're not so good at others. And the same thing is true of the immune system. We have different branches, and we've already met IgE, which is part of the true allergy system. So we can put this up here, that IgE pathways or reactions within that branch are considered true allergies. And that could be foods, it could be environmental things like pollen or dust or those types of things. Any reaction that happens in any of these other pathways are not considered allergies because they're non-IgE. They're typically considered sensitivities. But here's the deal, is that any food can react within any of these different pathways. And that poses several different problems for us, at least from a testing standpoint. And I'll show you in just a moment how testing food sensitivity can be a little bit like a shell game. It's like a guessing game. But when we look at the organization of the system, just like in the military, the IgE system reacts in a certain way to certain kinds of things. And same thing with the IgG or the IgM or the IgA, or what's called the complement system, which is completely independent of the antibodies that those first four represent. But the key here is to remember, any food can react within any of these pathways. Any food can react within more than one of these. So you may have an IgG and an IgA reaction to the same food. You have two branches of your immune system reacting. But regardless of where the reaction is coming from, it's all driving an immune response, which means there's going to be inflammation and there's going to be some kind of a symptom that's associated with that. Now, I just mentioned that testing for food reactivity or food sensitivities can be like playing a shell game. Hopefully you're familiar with the shell game. Basically, this is where you have three shells like the picture shows, and underneath is a little ball or a pea, and the person doing the shell game puts the shell over the pea or the object that you're supposed to find and mixes them up and kind of does some sleight of hand, and then you're supposed to pick which shell the pea or the ball is under. Well, imagine this, going back to our branches in the immune system. Imagine that you're a classically trained physician and you're trained to look in a specific place for food reactions, and that's going to be the IgE reactivity session. Now, this is changing as more medical doctors are getting into alternative or integrative type concepts, they're starting to look in different places, which is fantastic. But still, within the conventional world, most of the food sensitivity testing or food allergy testing is happening with the IgE type testing only within that branch. So anything that's reacting outside of that, for example, you might look in the IgE branch, but your reaction actually is in the IgA system. All of a sudden, you get someone telling you, oh, you're not allergic to wheat, you're not allergic to dairy. But in fact, that's not even an accurate statement. Well, it is an accurate statement because it's a true allergy. But let's say that someone says you're not reacting to wheat or dairy, then that's not actually true because they didn't look in enough places to rule out all of the different possibilities. Now, this presents a little bit of a conundrum from us from a clinical standpoint when it comes down to deciding, do we do food sensitivities or do we not? And if so, how many places do we look? So the core problem with trying to find food sensitivities with testing is that no single test can check it all. There are just simply too many branches to too many different parts of the immune system that one technology or one testing methodology can actually catch everything. So again, I'm going to not warn you, I'm going to, I guess, educate you that if at any point in the past or in the future you have somebody say, let's do some food reaction testing, you really need to understand what the test is able to show you and what it's not, because even the best test out on the market, which we'll talk in just a moment about, even the best test on the market is going to miss something because the designers of the test and the technology always have to make compromises because no single test can test it all. Or to say, let's say that a lab combines technologies to test all these different branches. Well, the test would be so expensive and the technology so expensive for the lab to invest in that you'd end up paying, maybe, and I'm just making up a number to illustrate a point, maybe $10,000 to figure out what your food reactions are. Well, there's an easier way to do it that is almost doesn't cost you anything other than time and investment of effort. So the other thing to realize, aside from this fact that no test measures every single reaction within every different branch of the immune system, all tests, even the best technology out there, will miss something, and they have some degree of false positives and false negatives. Now, you're probably familiar with these terms, but just in case you're not, a false positive is where the test comes back and says, yes, you are reacting to this, when in fact you're not. And false negatives would be the opposite. The test says you're okay to eat something, yet clearly you eat it, and in real life it makes you feel worse because you're having a reaction. So false negatives and false positives are just part of the game. And in fact, I have conversations with designers of test technologies on a semi-regular basis. I'd say at least 3 or 4 times a year, especially if a new lab comes out or a new technology within a lab that I'm already working with. I want to talk to them and say, okay, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this particular test and why should I use it? And if I feel that the lab has put together a testing methodology that balances out false positives, false negatives, if I understand what the testing methodology is going to miss, then I'll have a better chance of using that test to give me something that's going to be actionable and relevant to trying to help someone get better. Now, beyond all this, there are some more complex issues that have to do with how your immune system responds and has nothing to do with the testing technology, has nothing to do with false positives, false negatives, and that would be what's called cross-reactivity and neoantigens. I'm going to explain those in just a little bit, but I want to get that out here for the moment because we're talking about some of the core problems and some of the reasons why we don't do testing on every single person, right? Sometimes it doesn't make sense, sometimes it does, and we try to make that decision on a person-to-person or case-by-case basis. Now, the current sensitivity testing, and there are multiple different test types that are available to us out there. The gold standard, believe it or not, is still an elimination provocation, and that's it very simply cleaning up your diet, getting rid of most of the things that we commonly understand to be high probability of causing reactions, and then reintroducing things somewhere down the road to see if you're having a response. That actually still is the gold standard. There is the classic conventionally trained allergist approach, and that's your IgE pathways, and that's typically done by skin prick testing, or now they're doing patches where the patch itself is impregnated with proteins associated with different foods, and they just stick it on your arm or your back, And when they pull it off down the road, is there a welt there? Is there a red spot? And that suggests that you're having that classic IgE response. And then there's the functional approach, which typically looks for sensitivities, and that can be done in blood. It can also be done in saliva, although saliva is more specific to the IgA branch rather than, say, the IgG branch, which is typically what we find in blood, although blood can measure multiple different ones. And you might think, well, it makes sense. If blood can measure more immunoglobulins than other things, then why don't we do that? And the answer is, well, that is a good idea. But again, no test will find everything. Everything, including blood tests, well designed, have false positives and false negatives, and they don't always account for things like cross-reactivity or neoantigens, which we'll explain momentarily. So problems focused with food sensitivity testing. No single test checks at all. You may be thinking, well, I've heard that there's this thing called ALCAT or MRT. Those are two different tests that have similar concepts. And honestly, the concept is pretty good, which is let's measure your immune cell. Let's take a white blood cell, for example, and measure how big it is, and let's expose it to the protein of a food. And if the cell gets bigger, then we'll assume that the immune system is making stuff in reaction. And that's really kind of the theory. The problem with that is we can't control for chemical and environmental factors. So for example, the pH of your testing media actually makes a difference in whether your immune system is going to react or not. Or you may have something where you're creating fluid inside the cell, but it's not actually an immune response, and that makes it look like the cell is swelling from an immune reaction when it's not. Or you may have impurities and chemicals or other environmental factors to which your immune system is reacting, and it's actually not the food at all. So ALCAT and MRT, even though they're promoted by many doctors as being a workaround for all these other problems, in reality, when you look at the technology and compare it to how the immune system works, really isn't that much of an advancement. In fact, in some cases, we find that these tests are completely inaccurate. And what I mean by that is ALCAT and MRT fail what's called split testing. And split testing is where we take one person's blood, but we separate it into two different samples. So it's the same blood. And we submit those to the lab under two different names. And if we get two different reports back, that means they failed the split testing. And this is what happens, unfortunately, with ALCAT, with MRT, and with a lot of the testing methodologies that are out there. The other problem, or one other problem that's associated with current technology with food sensitivity, is that most of the labs are using testing material that involve the proteins associated with raw foods. Now, that would be great if most of your clients were raw foodists. But here's the problem, is that when you cook food, it changes the protein structure, and it can either increase or decrease reactivity. So for example, you might have a reaction to raw tomatoes, but cook it and you're fine to eat marinara sauce, or it could be the other way around. So when most of our clients are not eating raw food and the labs are testing raw food versions, and we know that that makes a difference, then it automatically invalidates the test from a general conceptual standpoint. So what about these neoantigens and cross-reactivity? Well, neoantigens are basically, the term literally means new proteins or new antigens, new things that can create an immune response. So here's how we make a neoantigen. Let's say we have two separate proteins, protein A and protein B. Well, you don't react to protein A if you eat it separately. You don't react to protein B when you eat it separately. But if you eat them together and combine the proteins into what's called a neoantigen, or AB, then you start to have a reaction. And so the classic example, and this has been published in the immunological literature, is that we may have someone who is not reactive to wheat, not reactive to dairy, not reactive to tomatoes, but they eat pizza and they react to some combination of the proteins, and so they get sick if they eat pizza. But they get a dairy test and that's okay. They get a wheat test and that's okay. And they go, oh, you should be fine to eat pizza. But that's not the individual proteins. It's the neoantigen that's created when these proteins are actually connected together. And that's a huge problem for some people. Problem is that there are no labs that are testing for this. We know it's an issue. It's published in the medical literature. It's understood by all of our top immunologists. But there's no lab in the world that is, as of this time in recording this audio and video, there's nobody testing for this. Now, we do have some expectation that one of the labs we work with is working on this specifically to serve the interest of clinicians that are working with children, specifically in the autism spectrum, just because we know that this is a huge issue for them. But as of right now, we know it's a problem, but there's no test that will account for that. So that's the neoantigen section. What about cross-reactivity? Well, you may have heard me talk about cross-reactivity in other places, but cross-reactivity goes like this. You react to protein A, and protein A and protein B look alike at a molecular level. The protein structure is actually similar, and it really is a case of mistaken identity. In a situation like this, you can react to protein B as if it was protein A, but protein A specific tests are completely negative. So A looks like B, or you react to protein A, you eat protein B, it looks like protein A, and so all of a sudden you get an immune response, even though the testing says you shouldn't. Now, there is only one lab in the world that does this kind of testing, and it's centered in and around cross-reactivity associated with gluten. And again, this is very well published in the medical literature that some people with gluten reactions have reactions to things that the immune system think are gluten but are not. And let me give you just a very quick short list, and this is written in some of the supplementary material. Make sure you download and read the PDF that accompanies the email that brought you to this particular video lesson. But let me just throw out a couple. Dairy is a big gluten cross reactor. So is rice, so is corn, so are oats or oat protein. And so somebody may be doing a good job of being gluten-free, but they're eating other things that the immune system looks like or thinks looks like gluten, and they're having reactions, but the testing comes back and in some cases says, no, these foods should be perfectly fine. So again, there are a lot of confounding factors that kind of give us the understanding that it's probably not a good idea to have a blanket policy that you do food sensitivity testing on anyone. It really comes down to what information is going to give you, what information is it not going to show you, and in this specific context and person situation, do we expect them to have confounding factors like cross-reactivity and neoantigens? And the answer, again, is very much individual, and so we have to make that on a case-by-case basis. And here's an example of illustrating cross-reactivity. Let's say that somebody does not react to corn. They eat corn and they don't make any corn antibodies. But also this person eats gluten, and when they eat gluten, they do make gluten antibodies. So let me just correct something I said. They eat corn and there's no corn immune response, even though they may get symptomatic, because here's what I'm trying to illustrate. This person is going to test negative to corn on a corn test. They will test positive to gluten on a gluten test. But what if somebody in this situation eats corn and feels poorly afterwards? They have an immune response, but the test says it's negative. And in many cases, what's happening is they eat corn, and because corn is a potential cross-reactor to gluten, the body reacts and makes gluten antibodies to the corn, right? So they're not actually making corn antibodies. They're making gluten antibodies because the immune system thinks that the corn is gluten when in fact it's not. So this person would eat corn and feel bad, get a corn test, the test is negative, and the doctor or whoever's advising them says, oh no, you're not reacting to corn, you can keep eating it. So in some cases, I'll tell you that your real world experience trumps any of the fancy testing that we can have. Now, it doesn't mean that all tests have zero value. I want to make sure that I'm being clear on that, because even the worst design test out there is going to find something for somebody, and somebody is going to make a change based on that and experience an improvement in health and well-being. That response doesn't necessarily validate the concepts of and the principles behind all of the testing to begin with. So we need to be careful about making statements like, well, Aunt Sally did an LCAT and she eliminated all the foods and she got better. Well, guess what? We could have done that just by rolling the dice and picking some things at random in many different cases. So what about some other issues? Well, viruses can cause cross-reactivity with foods. We'll actually see this with some of the viruses that people have in their bodies all the time. Like, for example, most of us, the literature tells us that most of us have been exposed to, for example, the Epstein-Barr virus even though we may not have had mononucleosis. That's the virus that causes mono. So most of us have that in our body. A lot of us have it, but we have control of it. But sometimes the Epstein-Barr virus kind of gets a little bit crazy, and the virus causes cross-reactivity with all kinds of foods. And we might run a food reactivity test, and everything seems like the person's reacting to everything, but they're like, well, doc, I don't understand because I eat these foods and nothing happens. I don't feel worse. In fact, I feel better if I eat these foods. Well, again, sometimes you get viral cross reactivity. There's no true food based reaction. What we're seeing the immune system being heightened. We're seeing cross reactivity. We're seeing mistaken identity. And so what's printed on the page doesn't actually reflect reality in some of these cases. The other thing that could be an issue is that if we're going to talk about doing some food reactivity testing, understand that when you stop eating a food that you are reacting to, your antibody levels that tell us that there is a response go away after about 6 months or 6 weeks. They go back to normal. So in an ideal world, you would have eaten the foods that you're testing within the last 4 weeks, because if you've stopped eating them, at some point your antibody levels go down because you're not provoking your immune response. And in some cases, this one thing alone negates the need to do a test. And let me give you an example. A lot of my clients come to me and they're already gluten-free, they're already dairy-free, they're already not eating grains because somewhere along the way they discovered for themselves or read a book or an article that said, hey, it's probably a good idea to get rid of these things and see what happens. Well, someone may come to me and they've been gluten, dairy, and grain free for, say, 3 months, and they want to do a gluten test. Well, the only way that test is going to be valid is if they go back and eat gluten again, or dairy or grains, depending on what we're focused on testing. And sometimes that's just not a good idea because we know that they're going to get flared up. So sometimes we might want to do a test, but the circumstance is not right for us to say, okay, that makes sense to spend the money to go ahead and do that kind of testing. So remember, your body will make antibodies in some cases when you're reacting to foods, but when you stop eating that food and you stop provoking the immune system, that's going to go away. The antibodies that we're actually trying to test go back to normal, and so in that case, we might get a false negative result. Now, the Cyrex labs, which is the labs that we use to do our leaky gut testing, our autoimmune type testing, also has what I believe to be the best food reaction panel out there. And the reason why I say right now they have the best panels because they're trying to account for as many of these confounding variables as possible. Now, I will remind you that no test can do everything, and that includes this one as well. So for as good as this is designed, or as well as this is designed, it's still going to miss stuff. So just because everything comes back normal on someone's test doesn't mean they're not reacting to something in a way or in a type of a part of the immune system that wasn't accounted for in the testing methodology. Now, Cyrex Labs, this is what's called array number 10, checks for 2 different kinds of reactions. These are IgG and IgA reactions. Remember, these are in the sensitivity box. These are the most common non-IgE reactions, or the most common types of sensitivities, but it also checks raw versus cooked versions of foods that are commonly eaten that way, and tomatoes would be a good example. Now, I was part of the beta testing for this particular test. They worked on this in the technology for about 2 years before they brought it to the public. And I had this test done on myself, and thankfully I don't have very many reactions, but one of the things that surprised me was that I reacted to cooked salmon but not raw salmon. Now, at the time that this came out, I was eating cooked salmon probably once a week. And not saying that I was sick all the time, but it was obviously an immune reaction to a cooked version of a food. So I could go out and have salmon sashimi, go to, say, a sushi restaurant and be okay. But if I had cooked salmon, I know that my body is having an immune response to that. And even though I may not be able to, in the short term, attribute an immune response or feeling bad to eating cooked salmon, knowing that there's an immune activation from eating cooked salmon, I choose to not eat cooked salmon, which is a shame because I love it. But it is what it is. Now, the other thing that Cyrex does well is that they flag marginal reactions that look suspicious. It's not a yes, you react, no, you don't. They certainly have those, hey, there's no reaction here, hey, there's a huge reaction here, but they also flag these marginal reactions which may or may not be a problem, and that sometimes allows us to really tweak someone's diet by saying, hey, let's consider removing this for a while. And when we get to the point where we're going to reintroduce things, let's add these marginal responses because these are the ones that you probably have the greatest opportunity to add back without causing some major issues. Well, that's part of the introduction process, which we coach you through our one-on-one sessions. The other thing that Cyrex does well is that they do double validation. So there's no problem with failing split testing. This is the only lab that I know of that does this. They actually have every test is run twice by two different people. And at the end, when they get the reports, they compare them. And if the reports agree, then the test result goes out. But if the results do not agree with the double validation, then the techs go back and they run it again because obviously somebody made a mistake. So the double validation is a key thing. It means that we can have a lot of trust in the results that the lab is putting out. And the other thing that I like what they do with this particular test is they test about 180 foods. Most of them are foods that you're going to find on a paleo diet, and they include things like herbs and spices and food additives like guar gum or xanthan gum or carrageenan, which you don't always find on other tests. Now, some other labs do those things, but not necessarily in the way where they're looking like Cyrex does at more than one type of reaction and doing it again with double validation and flagging marginal responses. Now, even though I said that these guys are doing the best job, do I run this test on every client I have? The answer is no. And because I'm recording this for all of my clients, for you, I don't know recording this if we're doing a food reaction test with you or not. And if we've decided not to do that, then there are reasons why we've decided not to do it. And if we've decided to do it, it means that we have enough confidence that we're going to get some actionable results, or you've just basically said, Doc, I want to do this test. And I'm certainly not above doing a test if you really want to have the results. We'll talk about why that might be a good idea or bad, but ultimately, it's your decision. If you want to test, then I'll facilitate that as long as it's not completely unreasonable. So let's talk about elimination provocation. If we have an issue with the way most tests are done, and if we understand that there's this disconnection between how tests are designed and how the immune system is organized, then the fallback for us in most of our cases are elimination provocation. Now, I will tell you that even if you do a food reaction test and you get a report that says these are okay and these are not, because we know that test will miss something, you're still going to have to do elimination provocation. The advantage in some cases of doing a test up front is that it can speed up the process on some items, right? That's really the bottom line. So eventually you're going to do an elimination provocation anyways, even if it's to reintroduce strategically some of the foods that you identified that might have been marginal on, say, an array number 10 test, like we just talked about. Well, what is the elimination provocation process? Well, the first thing is clean up the diet based on our core 4 recommendations, as we've already discussed. Then we have to go into healing whatever's going on with the gut, whether it's infections or calming down the reactions from eating foods that you're reacting to or enzyme deficiencies, whatever the problem is. We either have to know that we've healed the gut or we've made some significant headway before it makes sense to feed food back into the system and potentially create an immune response in the very system and tissue that we're trying to heal. So I like to get at least 50% symptomatic control in the big picture, 75% of the way through, say, a gut protocol before we even start talking about this. And when we get to the point where we reintroduce foods, we want to make sure that we're doing it strategically. So we introduce foods one at a time, and we typically ask you to choose the foods that you miss the most or that would make life convenient first. So let's say there's a dozen things. How do you know what to introduce first? It's really up to you. I have no specific set way to do that. It's driven by you and by your desires and, again, convenience factors. So when do we reintroduce it? Typically somewhere around the 3-month mark. And again, this is going to be highly variable based on the person. We want to make sure that we've created that stable foundation for you first. Too early can cost you. We've seen this over and over again. I may tell somebody, Mrs. Jones, I want to make sure that you don't introduce foods. Well, sometimes people get a little, impatient. Sometimes they're tired of a diet and they want to add something back in, and they start playing around on their own. And all of a sudden we start seeing flare-ups and exacerbations, and it's okay, where's the problem? Why aren't you stable? And then we realize it's because somebody on their own accord went ahead and did things sooner rather than later. So too early can cost you. And in fact, it's one of these things that the longer you can delay provocation or introducing foods back into your diet, I'd say that the more successful that you're going to be in that process. Ultimately, food provocation is not required. We do have a lot of clients that do so well on the starting diet that they never go back. Now, ultimately, that is going to be up to you, right? We want to make sure that you have as much enjoyment out of your diet as possible without running the risk of your diet being part of the problem that's not allowing you to be well. So ultimately, the provocation phase is actually not required, but ultimately that is up to you. So what do you look for? Let's say that we're down the road, and I'm just trying to paint a big picture for you. Please don't take this as me saying, go ahead and do this and start looking for it. I'm just giving you this information ahead of time, so when we talk about it again, you've heard it at least once. When you do reintroduce food strategically, what do you look for? The first thing is responses that are unique to you. I mentioned earlier, particularly with food sensitivities, that the reactions that you're going to see from a symptom standpoint are unique to you and not to the food. So the question is not what does a dairy reaction look like or a tomato reaction, is what does my reaction to those foods look like? So typically that's going to be a flare-up of your general symptomatology. If we step back and look at the big picture and say, okay, your general symptom picture is fatigue and migraines and joint pain, then you can expect that to flare up with some foods that you're reacting to. For somebody else, it might be something else, a different symptom picture. So be familiar, well, of course you are familiar with what's bothering you, but make sure you're looking for that flare up of either things that have gotten better and just resolved, or things that are better but are still hanging on, and then you eat and they get flared up and they're worse. The other thing you can look for is something completely new or unexpected. And that is so open, I can't even really give you an example. But if you eat a food and all of a sudden you've got something you've never dealt with before, and it's significant enough that you can attach it to the food reintroduction, then obviously we're going to count that as a response. And we're going to say, okay, you failed that, and we need to stay away from that particular food. And there are a couple of old school issues with increased heart rate and what we call throat clearing responses, like having a little phlegm that you feel like you need to cough through or clear all the time, can be pretty accurate indications that you're having a response. And we'll walk you through this. In fact, you'll download a tracking sheet that will allow you to record all of your responses when it comes time for you to do your provocation. So here's your summary before we go. First of all, food sensitivity testing is completely fraught with challenges. Every test is going to miss something. And even if you are going to do a test, you're probably going to have to do an elimination provocation, or at least the provocation part of that. Elimination provocation remains the gold standard, and it has to be, or might have to be, repeated several times a year. This is another phenomenon that we've seen, is that sometimes if we do, say, an elimination provocation in the first 3 months, well, maybe we tell somebody, okay, 6 months down the road, I want you to clean up your diet again. Let's repeat this process. There are things that someone can discover they're reacting to 6 months down the road that they didn't discover their reaction to in the beginning. And this is just a reflection of the balance between what your body is willing to reveal and what it's not. And as your body gets healthier and your metabolic systems become under greater degrees of control, it can more accurately reflect what's going on internally. So you may have to repeat the elimination provocation challenge several times. Typically, we'll separate challenges by at least 2, sometimes 3 to 4 months. And again, we want to make sure that we wait until your general symptoms are at least 50% improved, and that's across the board, and at least 75% of the way through the gut protocol, although individual variability applies. And we want you to wait until we give you the thumbs up to say, yeah, now's okay for us to go ahead and start reintroducing some food. So those are the guidelines. That's the big picture. Make sure you download the PDF and read through that. I'm giving you this information well ahead of time from the point that you're actually going to need it. So make sure you keep this tucked away. We may have to come back and have you review this again, but I want to make sure that you've got the information. So take care. We'll talk to you again soon.